Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. The drama internally at Red Bull is not going away, with Christian Horner confirming that his man Daniel Ricciardo was axed for the team, partially orchestrated by none other than Helmut Marko, who wanted Ricciardo gone way back in June after the Spanish Grand Prix. Horner then went on a different tangent and said that actually, even though Ricciardo is now gone from the organisation technically, if Sergio Perez doesn't deliver, if Liam Lawson doesn't deliver, Ricciardo could still be back in the Red Bull seat for next year. What's going on internally at Red Bull? Why does everyone disagree on what their plans are? Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. First of all, big day for Ferrari today. Loic Serra, Jerome D'Ambrosio, two hirers from Mercedes over the last couple of months. Their gardening leave effectively was over as of today. So they are both in Maranello at the Ferrari office today, 1st of October, to join Ferrari for effectively their run, especially for 2026, for next year as well, is quite important. Both guys that of course worked with Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes over the last few years. Serra seems especially aligned with Hamilton on many of the features he wants from a car, so that could be quite important, certainly for 2026 and beyond. Leclerc was doing some testing at Fiorano, and of course, big day. There is talk as well, the fact that Serra, especially as their new technical director effectively, he's been on gardening leave for a few months, but it seems like gardening leave is pretty easy to get around in modern Formula 1, and the teams are able to kind of, well, Serra can do some stuff online and then kind of send an email and then you kind of get around it. That seems to be a kind of a common thing. So the belief is that Serra has been at least doing some work with that team already for some time. But look, what are Leclerc's chances from now to the end of the year? If it was a street race only championship, he'd be in the title fight. The reality is, that's not how it is. There's been a few difficult rounds this season. There have been some comparisons, and this is a real long shot, but I thought I'd just mention it for the Ferrari hopium, that Raikkonen's 2007 championship comeback was pretty mega. Of course, Hamilton could have won that championship, China, etc, etc. You guys know the story. But its similarities are there. Ferrari driver, pretty close in terms of ranking in the championship with 6 Grand Prix to go. At the time, Raikkonen had 74% of the leaders' points, and it's the same story here for Leclerc as well, although obviously the number of points is different because the point systems have been different, and bringing this comeback is going to be a taller order from Leclerc, no doubt about it. P2 is a McLaren, yeah, so, you know, there's some similarities, but realistically it is between Norris and Verstappen this year. Also, some other drama going down yesterday based on this new book by Guenther Steiner. He released this book, Unfiltered, foreword by Toto Wolff, and he made a few interesting statements, such as the fact that as far as he's concerned, if Charlie Whiting was still alive and in charge of race direction, basically from the FIA perspective at Formula 1, then Hamilton would be an 8-time world champion, and of course, well, the implication is that Abu Dhabi 2021 would not have happened as it could have done. This is actually what he said about, you know, just, well, in Guenther Steiner's words, what was going on there in Abu Dhabi. I think it's interesting. Look, Abu Dhabi 21 has been talked about to death. I just thought it was quite an interesting perspective to think about how that season would have looked, because sure, Abu Dhabi would have been different, but arguably that entire season would have been different. And I think in many ways, the FIA were kind of bailed out by Abu Dhabi on some level. Obviously, it was an absolute shambles, but the fact that they could just say, oh, Michael Massey made that major mistake, we're just going to fire him, and therefore it's all fine. Like, clearly that isn't and was never true in many respects. Like, the FIA's stewarding decisions that entire season were highly questionable, and in many respects have been highly questionable in the years since then. The fact that they got rid of Massey was like, oh, well, it was all Massey's fault, everything that went wrong. But, you know, if Massey wasn't in charge, if Charlie Whiting was still in charge, you know, Brazil probably would have been different in terms of, you know, punishments or whatever. Jeddah might well have been different. But even thinking back to Bahrain that year, I mean, even in Bahrain, track limits and stuff like that, like, you know, I think the FIA might have handled things differently anyway. So, you know, my feeling is that entire season and the way that it was handled was, you know, an absolute disaster in many respects, not just Abu Dhabi. And I do feel like it would have been significantly different had Whiting been alive. What that would have meant for the championship, of course, is, well, a matter of a debate. Steiner, of course, gives his perspective. But let's talk about the situation at Red Bull. RB, Daniel Ricciardo was let go not long ago now. I mean, he knew, Lawson knew, 2 weeks before the Singapore Grand Prix that was going to be his final race, but they wouldn't tell anybody for reasons seemingly unknown. When they rebranded, by the way, to RB rather than, well, I mean, Visa Cash App RB as opposed to AlphaTauri over the last couple of years before that, they apparently considered just selling the team entirely and just becoming a one-team operation, which I'm sure Zach Brown would have liked, but they decided not to because they could absolutely cash in from all the sponsors they were bringing in with this major rebrand. And fair enough, it's understandable given the limit of the rules that we currently have. But the Ricciardo point has been a big topic of the weekends. Of course, you know, even as people were mentioning, you could tell in Ricciardo's face that it was his final race, but he couldn't say anything, and people were saying, well, if this is it, Daniel, thanks for the memories. And, you know, of course, he went out with the final lap that he did, the fastest lap that he did, and, of course, quite a controversial set of circumstances that as well. But yesterday, we then got a big update here on the F1 Nation podcast from Christian Horner on the Ricciardo situation and exactly what it took to get to this point. So, Christian Horner is on, well, shall we say, the Thai side of the Red Bull business, as in, with all we were talking about a few months ago with that internal power struggle at Red Bull, Horner is very much well aligned with the Yavidya family and the Thai ownership of Red Bull that now effectively run the show after the passing of Dietrich Mateschitz. Marko is much more aligned with the guys on the Austrian side of the management that own 49%, Mateschitz' successor, and Oliver Mintzlaff and guys like that that run the show over there. But look, Horner versus Marko was a big talking point, and it seems like Horner had won the battle a few months ago. Marko was, you know, going to be fired. There was a rumour that Horner was going to clean house effectively with the people that wanted him disposed, but eventually Marko ended up staying and things seemed to calm down somewhat. There were some rumours, and this is like massive speculation as far as I'm concerned. I've not really heard any like good sources validate this, but there was a rumor that, you guys remember when Verstappen apparently had a contract clause that allowed him to just walk away if Marko were to leave? Apparently, and Marko apparently put that clause in, there was a rumour that Marko was allowed to have more power back at Red Bull if they took that clause out, basically. So there's a rumour that he did that, and now he's got a bit more power, which, you know, might add up a bit, because I'm not going to lie, with the way that the Horner-Marko internal power dynamic civil war was happening a few months ago, I wouldn't have thought Marko would have had the power to get Ricciardo out of the car. Seemed to be that Horner was taking charge again after he kind of cleared the allegations, but not really. The scandal, of course, comes to an end on some level, and Ricciardo is Horner's man. You know, that they're great boys, we think, even though there were rumours recently that Ricciardo wasn't especially happy with Horner and the way that this whole driver saga had been handled. But yeah, Horner says that Marko wanted Ricciardo gone around the Spanish Grand Prix, even around Barcelona. Helmut wanted him out of the car, he says. So pretty fascinating to think about, right? And yeah, basically there was a lot of pressure on Daniel already at that point. Marko wanted him gone. Marko's never really a big fan of the idea of bringing Ricciardo back, and Marko is more aligns with the Dietrich Mateschitz perspective of bringing up the younger drivers, investing in that talent, the type of, you know, investment that got Vettel and Max their starts in Formula 1 with the team as well. So it's understandable that Marko wouldn't want Ricciardo, and Marko isn't perfect. I mean, I think generally he knows what he's doing and makes reasonable decisions, but the likes of, you know, De Vries, I don't know what he was thinking there, to be perfectly honest. So, you know, there's some debate on that. But let's just rewind a little bit, because Spain, it was round 10 of this Formula 1 season, the 21st to the 23rd of June. And at that time in the championship, things looked like this. Ricciardo had scored 9 points at that point of the season. He was, well, he'd no-scored for the first 5 rounds. Sonoda had done an excellent job over those first few races when the car was more competitive than it is today. Yuki had scored 19 points over the first 10 or so rounds of the season. Ricciardo had only scored 9. So, you know, and we heard talk from Marko after Ricciardo was basically fired that Ricciardo was told at the start of the season, outperform Yuki substantially or you're gone type thing. And that is what he wasn't doing over the first half of the season, and therefore Marko wanted to pull the trigger then and there and get him out of the car. Now, for whatever reason, that didn't happen then, maybe just because they wanted to keep Ricciardo around, or because they still felt like the whole Red Bull Racing situation was a possibility, because, you know, at that time Perez had, his fall off had started, right? Because where Perez was the first 6 rounds compared to where Perez has been since then has been, I mean, even that is still remarkable to look at those numbers, even though Max is still scoring pretty decent points despite having not won since the Spanish Grand Prix. How wild is that, actually, that it's literally the Spanish Grand Prix that we're talking about here, with just the most recent race that Max Verstappen actually won. But yeah, Danny Ric was meant to be out of the car then, and there were interesting talks on this because Will Buxton noted back in June that Ricciardo had written on his own helmet, "not without a fight," as in not going down without a fight. And then he quote tweeted this to say that it gives context to this handwritten note of defiance. Actually, I've just noticed here that there's a community note that says this is incorrect. Ricciardo states that he wrote this during the Monaco Grand Prix, so apparently that's irrelevant, so fair enough. But nonetheless, that might have been a feeling because obviously Monaco was earlier than Spain, and Horner is saying that Marko wanted him gone in Spain, but maybe, you know, there was a feeling internally that they wanted Ricciardo gone before that, which might well be true on some level. So this is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, the fact that Marko actually has some power. I mean, there was a pretty funny quote tweet here, really, when you find out your GOAT still has it. I don't know how many people is that, you know, Helmut Marko can't be the GOAT for that many people, but for those that he is, I guess, fair enough. And, look, he's still clearly got some power and some say because he was clearly enough, vehemently against Ricciardo staying in the team, and now they have come to the conclusion of getting Ricciardo out of the team. The next debate on this, though, is what happens next for Ricciardo, because clearly Helmut Marko wants him long gone. There is a possibility of Ricciardo staying on as a Red Bull ambassador. I think that if the right terms were offered to Ricciardo, he would take the arrangement. It does make a fair bit of sense, but you know, if I was Ricciardo, I would be somewhat affected by the way this whole thing has been handled, the fact that he didn't really get the send-off that I would say he deserved, whatever you want to say. But look, that is a possibility. Marko is probably not against that. What he's really about is making sure that younger drivers get their chances in the Formula 1 car in the RB as it stands, and Liam Lawson is getting that drive for the final 6 rounds of the season. But Christian Horner then speculates, I mean, he's not exactly speculating, he's the one that makes the decisions at the end of the day, even with Marko potentially having more power than he previously did, saying that Ricciardo could well be back in a car. And this was a very interesting statement, actually, that sure, they want to keep Ricciardo on in an ambassadorial capacity, but is it impossible that he gets a drive again next season? No, not according to Christian Horner. He said the following: one never really knows. If Lawson doesn't get the job done, if Perez doesn't get the job done, we know what Daniel's capability is. So, yeah, I mean, how about this? And it wouldn't make any sense. Like, the way that they've dealt with this whole situation is so strange. To then throw out the idea that Ricciardo might still be getting the drive is like, what are we talking about here? But look, fair enough. They've not locked in anything guaranteed. Well, technically they have, because Perez has a contract for the next 2 years. But the way that Red Bull act is as if they don't have a second driver at Red Bull locked down for next season alongside Max. Lawson has a contract with RB from now to the end of the season, but he does not have a contract for next year. That has obviously raised speculation that what they're trying to do with Lawson is to see if he's ready for Red Bull. If he is, they might put him in there. If he's not, they might keep him at RB. That is probably the most likely of the options as it stands, with Perez staying on. And of course, Perez is making his defiant statements on social media saying, I ain't going anywhere, I'm not effing leaving, despite the rumours that he's going to retire in Mexico, which does not seem to now be the case. But it doesn't prevent Red Bull from firing him if he doesn't perform. I mean, you know, we can go back to these numbers, can't we? Looking at Sergio Perez, he's 8th in the championship, way ahead of Fernando Alonso, but, you know, he's now behind Russell, he's behind Hamilton, Sainz, Piastri, Leclerc, Norris, etc., and his teammate is up here at 331 points. You look at the last few rounds, let's say since Spain, or whatever you want to say, I mean, he scored, what, 11, 17, 24, 32, 37 points since then. And Max Verstappen in that time frame has scored well over 100, right? I mean, just did the numbers and Max has scored well over, I think it's 137 points in that same time frame. So, yeah, not pretty, of course. And if Perez keeps performing like this, as he has done over the last 10, 12 rounds, then, you know, how can that justify keeping the seat? Obviously, the difficulty is, who do you put in instead? And, you know, clearly, I thought the fact that they're getting rid of Ricciardo from RB shows that they don't think that he's ready for Red Bull Racing. They don't think he's ready to be Verstappen's teammate again. They don't think he's got it as he used to have it. That's certainly Marko's perspective. Marko made it very clear after he stepped away and they fired him, basically, that, yeah, Ricciardo didn't have the dog in him that he used to or whatever, right? That was effectively the implication that he was not the driver that he once was, and therefore they're getting rid of him. And that's what part of Red Bull say. And then the other part of Red Bull, as in Horner, is now saying, well, you know, if the time comes, maybe Ricciardo comes back. It's like, surely the whole point of firing him is because you know that he's not good enough anymore. That's the implication anyway. And the numbers kind of reflect that, to be fair. Like, I'm not sure Ricciardo for Perez is, you know, a massive fix for Red Bull to win them this year's Constructors or anything, but it might be worth a try. You could certainly argue it, and, you know, you could certainly argue many other options over Perez as it stands, but Ricciardo didn't seem to be one of them until all of a sudden he's now back on the radar. So very confusing. I think the reality is, if Marko does have any power still, which he does seem to, it's just confusing why every single thing that Marko says to the media, Horner will then usually come out with the opposite perspective, and often the other way around as well. It's like, are they not meant to be working for the same team? It still doesn't feel like it. And that's why Jos Verstappen's point on the team, you know, the internal drama, the team falling apart, whatever, like, definitely still rings true. I guess the other piece of this, though, is effectively confirmation, as Horner said in that quote, that Lawson has a chance. I mean, basically, if Lawson gets the job done, if he doesn't not get the job done, if he does get the job done, as is the opposite of what Horner says here, then yeah, the Red Bull seat is potentially there for the taking. And obviously the same theory if Perez doesn't deliver either. So that's quite clear for Lawson that the chance is there for the Red Bull seat next season if he really delivers. But yeah, as I say, Jos Verstappen is now doubling down. It is just incredible, right? Like, no other team is built in the way that Red Bull are built, with everything that happens there behind the scenes. Obviously, Newey's gone, Wheatley's gone, Courtney's gone, among others we talked about yesterday, the likes of Rob Marshall and Dan Fallows, among others, over the last few years that have departed Red Bull. And yeah, Jos Verstappen now gives his comment on it and says, look, this is what I warned about earlier in the year. I said that if Horner stays on, the team's going to explode. Now that's what's happening, right? So yeah, you've got Marko and Horner constantly disagreeing on basically everything. You got Jos Verstappen, who's much more so in the Marko camp. I mean, we know that this guy hates Christian Horner and makes that very clear every time he says anything to the media. And Jos Verstappen is obviously very close with Max, who's the star driver of the team. So just because the Red Bull drama off the track has calmed down over the last few months doesn't mean this is the last we're going to hear of it, and doesn't mean that it's not affecting decisions behind the scenes, because, you know, there clearly are still problems at Red Bull in terms of figuring out the civil war. Like, the resolution of it does not seem clear at all, with all the parties still warring in various ways. And the car isn't as competitive anymore. So, like, there are plenty of push factors, I think, is the conclusion here for Max Verstappen to potentially get out of there. But very much intrigued to your thoughts, as ever, on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.